In the opening chapters of Matthew, the author makes use of 4 ancient prophecies claiming a contemporary fulfillment in his Jesus story. Matthew's method is not really new. The search for new meaning in ancient prophecies continues an interpretive tradition that reapplied the timeless words of the past to successive generations of the present. I'm Ross Nichols for Horeb Institute, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is Sunday School. Get ready. Today we're going to be talking about prophets and prophecy and the way that ancient people interpreted those timeless words. I want to tell you that Matthew's chapter 1 and 2 frame the gospel of the Jesus story, basically, at least when it comes to the infancy narratives, using 4 ancient prophecies. These are Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, and Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 15. Now, the thing that I want to begin with is I'm going to be up front with you and tell you that the author of Matthew pulls the single text out of context. So the question becomes, did Matthew do anything wrong in doing that? Did Matthew, or the writer of Matthew, come up with something that was new? Is this some sort of Hellenized version of biblical interpretation? Those are the kind of questions that we're going to look into today. Now, for the answer to these questions, we have to dive deep into the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, and that's where I want to go today. I want to begin with some background, some necessary information from the Hebrew prophets, and so we begin today in several texts. I'm going to give you 4 texts to kick us off this morning. Those are Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 16, Isaiah chapter 29, and a couple of passages from Daniel. You'll see those on your screen. Open up with me today, open your Bible to the book of Isaiah, chapter 8 and verse 16, which says in the ASV, "Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples." Now, we're going to talk about the idea that certain books are sealed and what that means. Notice, seal the Torah among my disciples. Some translations will say, seal the Torah in my learning. But the idea is that these ancient texts are sealed. They require somehow to get past that seal. Now go with me to the next passage, which is Isaiah chapter 29, and we're going to begin in verse 10, Isaiah 29:10. "For Jehovah hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed your eyes, the prophets, and your heads, the seers, hath he covered. And all vision is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I cannot, for it's sealed. And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I'm not learned. So here, and we're going to break these down a little bit in just a moment, but here, once again, it says that we're dealing with words which are sealed. Now look with me at the book of Daniel. We're going to do quite a bit in Daniel today. I think that many of you who love prophecy love Daniel. Look at Daniel chapter 9, and I just want to pick up verse 24. Daniel 9, verse 24, and it says, 70 weeks are decreed upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish transgression, to make an end of sin, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Again, this is the ASV. One more set. Go with me to Daniel chapter 12. And we're going to begin in 12, verse 4, Daniel 12:4. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. This passage says that the sealing is for a specific time, leaving the door open for many of you who love prophecy and love to dig into this thing to begin to find an interpretation, an answer to some of these words. By the way, we're going to come back to Daniel 9. Don't worry. Look at Daniel chapter 12, verse 9. And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed till the time of the end. So again, we're looking at a book, a collection of prophecies, if you will, and some of these matters, it says, are sealed. Now, the first thing I want to touch on just briefly as we prepare to enter into the material today, what do we mean by sealed? And one of the examples that you can put in your notes to look at later, 1 Kings 21:8 talks about the sealing of a document. I know that most of you are good, hard-working students of the Bible, and so you know that these ancient documents seal was placed on, and it was pressed and stamped. The document is sealed. Now, the interesting thing, if we go back to chapter 29, I just want to bring this up. In 29, where it talks about in verse 11, all of this has become, and this is the quote, as the words of a book or a scroll that is sealed. In other words, it's not really sealed if you read in context, but it's as if it may as well be sealed, because no matter who you give it to, they can't read it. Whether you give it to someone who is learned and they say, I can't because it's sealed. If you give it to somebody who can't read it, they say they can't. But here's something interesting, and this is a footnote on this passage from the New Oxford Annotated Bible, 5th edition. It says this on that verse, Isaiah 29:11. Ultimately, quote, the significance of Isaiah's prophecies will be understood only when later generations read them. So the meaning in Isaiah 29:11 is that we have a document which is sealed, just like we read in Daniel, various passages from Daniel that we covered. And it just means that there is going to be a time when these words will be understood. And believe me, there are quite a few other passages, but I didn't put them in the class today because we have quite a bit to cover. Before we look at Matthew and the way that Matthew made use of the ancient prophecies that appear in chapters 1 and 2, I think we have to look at, other ancient interpretations and interpreters and see how they used the words of the prophets as they looked at the words of the prophets in front of them. So I want to begin with the Bible, because within the biblical text, we have a few examples of one person who is interpreting words that were written before his time. So I want to begin on that note with Jeremiah chapter 25. Go with me to Jeremiah chapter 25, and we're going to pick up at verse 11. Jeremiah 25, beginning in verse 11, and it says, And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it shall come to pass, when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith Jehovah, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it desolate forever. Now, one point. Well, let me get one more passage. Let's look at Jeremiah 29 before I give you this. Jeremiah 29 in verse 10 says the following, For thus saith Jehovah, after 70 years are accomplished for Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. Now, one of the main points that I want to bring up, because we're going to need to know this as we move forward. A lot of people believe that the 70 years is describing 70 years of captivity in Babylon. But that's actually not what Jeremiah is talking about. He's talking about a 70-year period where Babylon rules over the nations, if you will. They have the power over the nations. That's what Jeremiah is talking about. So at times people kind of mix that up, and they'll look at these texts and they'll say, well, technically, if you do the math, it's not 70 years in Babylon. That's not what it says it is anyway. So Jeremiah penned this and talked about the 70 years of Babylon's rule, if you will. And then Daniel later is going to look at these very texts. So go with me to Daniel chapter 9. Here we are, Daniel chapter 9, and I've got several verses. Let's begin in verse 1, Daniel chapter 9 and verse 1. In the first year of Darius the son of Ahasuerus of the seed of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years whereof the word of Jehovah came to Jeremiah the prophet for the accomplishment or the accomplishing of the desolations of Jerusalem, even 70 years. Now, based on what I just said about the 70 years, we're going to have some questions. We're going to have to answer, is Jeremiah's word being reinterpreted by Daniel? That's one of the questions that I want you to be putting in your notes right now as we look further into this particular text. Now, notice that he's talking about desolation. So just scroll down to verse 17. Now, therefore, O our God, hearken unto the prayer of thy servant, and to his supplications, and cause thy face to shine upon thy sanctuary that is desolate for the Lord's sake. Notice we're talking about the desolations that he is talking about based on Jeremiah, okay? It's his understanding. Verse 18, O my God, incline thine ear and hear, open thine eyes and behold our desolations and the city which is called by thy name. For we do not present our supplications before thee for our righteousness, but for thy great mercy's sake. Now, I want you to scroll down to verse 22. Now, in Daniel 9, beginning in verse 22, this is probably, and it's beyond the scope of this class to fully break into Daniel 9, 22 through 27, but this is probably, arguably, one of the most intensely studied passages that people would classify as prophetic. I just want to pick something up here to make my point. In 22 and 23, it basically just says, to paraphrase, that Daniel has asked for understanding, and someone comes to Daniel with answers to his questions, basically. Now, in verse 24, notice what it says. 70 weeks are decreed upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And then it gets into all sorts of particulars related to the interpretation provided in Daniel 9. Remember, Daniel is looking back. His whole question is based on Jeremiah's word about 70 years for Babylon to rule the nations. Now, the question becomes, if you read Daniel closely, he's taken this, many of you would say, well, for good reason. He's got insight. He's interpreting Jeremiah's 70 years, which seemed to be actually 70 years of 365 days apiece, right? He's now looked at this, and if you work through it, it's now become 490 years, right? Because what was originally described as 70 years has become, in this interpretation, 70 weeks of years. Again, it's outside the scope to fully dive into this topic. It's got to be a class on its own. But I want to ask the question, is Jeremiah taking the words of, or is Daniel taking the words of Jeremiah and reinterpreting them, whether he's got insight from heaven or not? And the answer to that question sets us up for what is to follow, because I see Daniel's making use of Jeremiah 25:11 and 12 and Jeremiah 29:10, his use, his understanding, his interpretation to be a gateway into the class today, and it's going to pave the way for us to move into the way Matthew uses some of these texts. Now, we see a similar method, meaning we see a similar taking of an ancient prophecy and interpreting that to fit a later time among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these particular interpretations are known as pesher, or plural, pesherim. Now, if you look up the word pesher or pesherim, if you look that up in a lexicon, for instance, use the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament or Brown Driver Briggs, we're talking about the three-letter root pe, shin, resh, which gives us the word pesher. You're going to find that that word is universally interpreted or understood or defined as to interpret, to explain, or depending on the form of the word, interpretation or solution or explanation. So what we do is we see this word used throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls in these pesherim as, here's what the prophecy said, here's the explanation, and we're going to give you some examples of that. But I wanted to know, is that word found in the Hebrew Bible, and where? It is. It's found in one passage where it is used in Hebrew form, but it's really an Aramaic loan word. That's what all the lexicons say. In other words, it's originally, the pe, shin, resh root is an Aramaic word that's used in the Hebrew Bible, mostly, in fact, all but one occurrences appear in Aramaic sections of Daniel chapter 2, verse and chapter 7. But go with me to the one occurrence in the Hebrew Bible where it is a Hebrew word, and that's in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 1. And it says, "Who is the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing?" The word translated interpretation is the word pesher in Hebrew. "A man's wisdom makes his face to shine, and the hardness or strength, as it says in Hebrew, of his face is changed." By the way, does my face shine? If it does, then it's because of the wisdom or the setting of the camera software. Either way. But the idea is that pesher means interpretation, and this is going to be a big clue as we move forward in the material today. Now, 34 times in 26 verses between Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, we find this word interpretation used. Anyone who's ever picked up the book of Daniel knows that it's full of dreams and interpretations. So, for instance, in Daniel chapter 2, and I'm not going to dig deep on this, but just use it as a foundation for what follows. In Daniel chapter 2, we see the use of the word pesher in various forms 13 times in Daniel chapter 2. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, we have, as you know, the story of a dream by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and you remember the demand. He demands of all the magician and the wise men of his day, not only that they give him the interpretation of his dream, but he actually asked for the dream itself and the interpretation. So Nebuchadnezzar's dream, over and throughout the chapter 2, we see mention of the idea of interpretation. Every time that word in the Hebrew, or the Aramaic, I should say, is pei, shin, resh, that three-letter root. So we are going to look, by the way, at one text in Daniel later where we're going to really dig deep. But for now, I've got one passage in Daniel chapter 2. Go with me to Daniel 2 and verse 45, just to illustrate the use of pesher from the Aramaic as it's translated by the ASV. In verse 45, it says, "For as much," this is Daniel relaying the interpretation, "for as much as thou sawest that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is certain." The pishrei is certain. All right, that's the way it reads in the Hebrew or in the Aramaic. Now, if we moved forward, and again, you can do a search and find every occurrence of this word, but I'm just hitting the high points. Daniel chapter 4 is also filled with this particular Aramaic word, pei, shin, resh. It occurs 8 times. Once again, we have a dream by Nebuchadnezzar, and this dream is about a tree. You can read all about it and dig into the details in your own time. But 8 times this particular word, always with the meaning of explanation or interpretation of something which is divinely imparted, is the intended meaning of the word. Daniel chapter 5. Once again, in Daniel chapter 5, this time we have 10 times where this particular Aramaic word for interpretation is used. You remember in this particular story in Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar has a manifestation. He's got this big party going on, and a big hand writes on the wall, the old proverbial, the writing on the wall. And the message can be read, but it can't be interpreted. This requires special skill. So this, again, Daniel comes through. Now, I really want to dig into one passage in Daniel because I think it really sets us up for the look that we have coming in the Gospels. And that's in Daniel chapter 7, beginning in verse 13. So go with me to Daniel 7, and I just want to pick up 13 and 14 first. It says, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, there came with the clouds of heaven one like unto a son of man. And he came even to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. There was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all the peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, in his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed." Now, one point that I want to make about Daniel 7, and this might be something we discuss in the after class, is that if you begin in Daniel chapter 1 and read the first 6 chapters, all of that material is presented in the third person. Only in Daniel 7 do we begin seeing passages which employ the first person, where it says, "I, Daniel, beheld, I, Daniel." So I put forward in other classes that I've taught that Daniel 7 could represent an earlier strata of the book itself. The other chapters which precede it talk about things, stories that are being relayed about Daniel and about his captivity and the things that happened to him during his time. Those are all third person, as if they're conveyed by another author. But in Daniel 7, we get something that is quite unique. Now, everyone knows that when we look at Daniel chapter 7, it's not like it's difficult to interpret, right? You have the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, presenting himself to the Ancient of Days. Who are the characters in this vision? The Son of Man, the Ancient of Days. Here's the way most people understand this. The Son of Man is the Messiah. He's coming on the clouds. And who is the Ancient of Days? Well, that's God. That's the Father, as some would describe this person, this character in the vision. But the question is that what this means? It's certainly what was understood by many late interpreters. In fact, I would say it's almost exclusive that ancient interpreters understood this to be talking about a Messiah who would come on the clouds of heaven. It's not just restricted to Christian views. It's in Judaism as well. In fact, there's this passage in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 98 where it lists all sorts of passages from the Hebrew Bible where the discussion is about what do we know about the Messiah, which, by the way, we're going to do an extensive class on the Messiah coming up in the next several weeks. But here's an example from Sanhedrin 98. This discussion, here's what it says. If Israel is worthy, the Messiah will come, quote, with the clouds of heaven. Daniel 7:13. But if they're not worthy, says the discussion, he will come, quote, humble and riding on a donkey. Zechariah 9:9. Now, it's interesting, and we're going to look more at these later as we get into these passages in the gospel narratives. Both of these, let me do quotes, both of these passages are considered in Second Temple Judaism to be messianic, right? But this question in Sanhedrin 98 says it could go either way. Either the Messiah will come on the clouds of heaven, as Daniel 7 says it, which says that people believe that to be a messianic passage, or maybe the opposite. Maybe he's humble, he's lowly, he's riding on a donkey. Now, everyone knows that the phrase Son of Man, by the way, the Aramaic is Bar Enosh, which is what we find in Daniel chapter 7. Ezekiel uses it more than 90 times. Ben Adam, there it means just a human. But most people took this Bar Enosh of Daniel chapter 7 messianically, and this is sort of a higher tier of Son of Man. The Gospels, though, use Son of Man as a descriptor for Jesus of Nazareth. And if we trust the red letters, then Jesus himself uses Son of Man to refer, self-referring to him, his own role. We'll get more into that later. But the book of Revelation also uses the language of Daniel 7, which is another interesting thing. Ancient writers were interpreting this to mean that this figure, this messianic figure, is coming on the clouds. The Didache in saying 16 also uses this imagery. And that doesn't even include apocryphal and deuterocanonical texts. Lots of people zeroed in on Daniel 7, 13, and 14. Now, all of these texts from the Second Temple period that I've covered, that I've mentioned briefly, all look at this as messianic and the Messiah is coming on the clouds, or that's a possibility. But what does the text say? What does Daniel 7 say that it means? Because this is going to lead us into our questions today. Look with me at Daniel chapter 7, and let's pick up in verse 15, and that's going to lead us into the rest of this understanding. This is right after, it's on the heels of one like the Son of Man going to the Ancient of Days, and the kingdom was given to him. But look at the next verse. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was grieved in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near unto one of them that stood by and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made me know the interpretation of the things. So wait a minute. Did Daniel not say, oh, I get it, the Messiah is going to come back on the clouds of heaven after he receives the kingdom from the Ancient of Days? No, that's not what Daniel said. Daniel said, I was troubled. I didn't know what this meant. And someone gives him the meaning, right? The interpretation of this point. Now look with me down at verse 18. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Now, wait a minute. So it sounds like, remember the vision, the Son of Man that receives the kingdom? He doesn't know what it means, and he's told that here's the meaning. And the meaning is that the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom. So now I'm starting to put together the way this ancient prophecy was intended to be understood. Look down at verse 21. I beheld that the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High. And the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. So could it be, if I pay attention, that I make an association here between the Son of Man coming on the clouds, presenting himself to the Ancient of Days, and receiving the kingdom? Could it be that this is referring to a group and not an individual? Look down at verse 25. And he shall speak words against the Most High and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. Then he shall think to change the times and the laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and half a time. Look down at verse 27. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Interesting. This means that this prophecy, which is clearly given, in order to understand its meaning, one must have the right interpretation. This is like a genre of material that is recorded by sacred historians, and we find it in the Bible very heavily in the book of Daniel, but we've given a couple of examples so far. Now, let me also, while we're talking about this idea of interpretation and the word pesher, pei, shin, resh, there's a very similar word that appears in a certain section of Genesis, but there, it's clearly not Aramaic, it's Hebrew, and it's pei tav resh. Pei tav resh. One letter difference, and normally I don't even like to get into this because people start switching letters and being so creative and getting off the mark. But I will say that according to the lexicons that I've looked at, there is an association between our pesher and this particular word that I'm talking about. It appears only 14 times in 11 verses, all in Genesis, and only in 2 chapters, Genesis 40 and Genesis 41. And if you know your Bible, you know that those 2 chapters deal with interpretations of dreams, because Joseph is referred to, according to Genesis, as the dream master. So again, we're talking about interpretation, and this is very important. Both of the words, the Aramaic and the Hebrew, though they're spelled slightly different, both of these words are associated with divinely assisted interpretation, seeking to understand previous prophetic predictions in one's present, right? Try to say that 3 times. Now, I want to move to the Dead Sea Scrolls next. If we think about the idea of pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Pesharim in the plural, we're dealing with interpretations. So I want to ask the question as we entertain, as we go through these examples, does this give us any basis or foundation for an approach to the way the gospel writers interpreted prophetic text? Now, I'm going to give a couple of examples. In fact, I have 3 in mind where I'm going to show you a Hebrew passage from a prophet, and then I'm going to show you a text from Qumran, one of these Pesharim, and we're going to show you how they interpreted these things a little bit earlier, a little to a time a little bit after the time of Jesus, right? Roughly, say, 100 years BCE to a little bit, maybe 70 of the Common Era, or AD. And the following examples, a prophetic text from an earlier prophecy is interpreted in the light of current events. It's taking ancient words, the timeless words of the prophets, and it's looking at them in a new generation, new people, new events, and someone says that spoke of this event, this person. So let's start in the book of Hosea, chapter 5, verse 13. Hosea, chapter 5, beginning in verse 13. And it says, when Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, then went Ephraim to Assyria and sent to King Jareb, but he was not able to heal you, neither will he cure you of your wound. For I will be unto Ephraim as a lion, and as a young lion to the house of Judah. I, even I, will tear and go away. I will carry off, and there shall be none to deliver. Now, if we look at this text in context, notice I'm just reading a little snippet from the story. It's quite clear that we're dealing with 2 kingdoms, the house of Judah and the house of Ephraim, and their collective unfaithfulness. That's what the story is about. And God here, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Jehovah in the ASV, is speaking. He is the lion who will tear and go away. This has a particular historical context. We're dealing with a particular time. Now, you may not have the Dead Sea Scrolls handy, but I've put in the description a couple of options for you. I highly recommend the version that I use. Geza Vermish's Complete Dead Sea Scrolls, links in the description. But I really like, and I've come to use more every day, really, the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition. The link for that is in the description of the video as well. But here's what it says in 4Q 167, which is, by the way, one of these Pesher. It's an interpretation. Whoever penned what we call 4Q 167, that's not what he called it. That's not a very sexy title. It means Cave 4, and this document number is assigned to one of these Pesher. It's 4Q Hosea Pesher. In other words, it is an interpretation of Hosea. And here's what it says. Its interpretation, what I just read, Hosea 5:13 and 14, concerns the last priest who will stretch out his hand to strike Ephraim. So that means that the writer of this Pesher is trying to say that text in some way, properly interpreted for that time in which the Pesher is written, is talking about a priest. The priest is the lion, but that's not what it meant, evidently, if you read Hosea chapter 5. But what I want to show is that in the ancient world, we find at times an ancient verse is interpreted within a new context, a new event, a new person. The writer of this scroll has someone in mind. We're going to look at a couple more examples. the next passage, and these are just little tidbits to prepare us for what's coming in the class. Look with me at the prophet Nahum, at Nahum chapter 2. Nahum 2, and I want to look at verse 11, and it says, "Where is the den of the lions and the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion and the lioness walked, the lions whelp, and none made them afraid?" This particular passage, Nahum chapter 2, verse 11 in the Hebrew Bible, is interpreted according to 4Q 169, which is a pesher of the book of Nahum, interprets this. In its original context, by the way, it's situated in a time when Nineveh was great. This is sort of a taunt on Nineveh. In fact, if you look back up in the chapter, in chapter 2, verse 8, in your own time, you'll see Nineveh is clearly mentioned. But the writer of 4Q 169, this Nahum Pesher, he found a way to put those words into the environment in which he lived. And here's what it says. Its interpretation concerns Demetrius, king of Yavin, which means Greece, who sought to enter Jerusalem by counsel of the seeker after smooth things. Now, anybody who's read any book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, or if you've studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, the seekers after smooth things are often understood to represent the Pharisees. All right? And we have other lines in this pesher where we encounter a lion of wrath who punishes the seeker after smooth things. So what was originally set in an Assyrian setting, historically, contextually, is reinterpreted as if it's talking about a Seleucid ruler, right? Hashmonean abuses and conflicts with Jerusalem factions. Nahum's original taunt becomes a lens in which a later writer is going to look at, interpret foreign kings and so forth, and internal Jewish rivals. So we get an ancient text from the prophet Nahum. It is reinterpreted, understood according to this pesher, to drop right into a later time in history. That's what we're dealing with here. Now, let's look at the next text. In the next text, we're dealing with a pesher on a passage or passages from the prophet Habakkuk. So go with me to Habakkuk, and I want to pick up in chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Chapter 2, verse 1. "I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, and will look forth to see what he will speak with me and what I shall answer concerning my complaint. And Jehovah answered me and said, Write the vision, make it plain upon tablets, that he may run that readeth it. For the vision is yet for the appointed time, and it hasteth toward the end, and shall not tarry. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, and will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright in him, but the righteous shall live by his faith." Interesting. Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Clearly, this is set in a certain time, but notice how this particular text leaves some things somewhat ambiguous. It talks about how the vision is for a time to come, right? So that clearly gives a later writer an opportunity to say, and now it's that time. And that's exactly what happens. So what happens with Habakkuk chapter 2 is that in a particular pesher of Habakkuk, you'll see on the screen, it's 1Q Habakkuk. Here's what it does when it interprets what I just read. Its interpretation concerns More Hatzadik, or the righteous teacher. Some texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls refer to a figure, obviously the leader of a community, who is, as it says, to whom God has made known all the mysteries of the words of his prophets. Now, elsewhere in this pesher, we learned that the Chaldeans, that's the original context, have now been manifested as another world ruler, the Kittim. In other words, they'll read a passage which in the original context talks about the Babylonians, but the reader, at the time that this Habakkuk pesher is written, they don't see it as talking about Babylon. They still see it. It was talking about Babylon. But now, you see, its interpretation is the world ruler in front of them in their own day. So they see it, the Kittim, which is typically in scroll studies understood to represent the Romans, right? Now, what we're talking about, though, again, in Habakkuk chapter 2, we're dealing with the appointed time. And at the appointed time, things will hasten. So these examples show that in Second Temple times, in the time that as we move into the story of the Gospels, which we're about to do, and the Gospels' use of certain texts, what we're going to see is that for later writers who are seeking to find themselves in these texts, to keep these texts relevant, they do this very creatively because for them, they don't see it as taking things out of context. Like a lot of polemics, a lot of critics of the Gospels will just look at a text like we're going to look at and say, well, clearly Isaiah 7 is not talking about the time of Jesus and the birth of, that's not what it's talking about. Go back and read it. People who do that don't understand that the writer is doing something very common. That person who wrote those texts into Matthew's story is just following an ancient interpretive method. And those who claim otherwise just don't know. So this is an opportunity to set the record straight. According to the people who were doing this, who were making these interpretive attempts to interpret and find themselves in these texts, were doing something because what they were doing was they were saying the text is alive. Yes, it spoke in the time of Nahum. Yes, it spoke in the time of Habakkuk, but it also speaks to me. Aha, I found our situation in the prophets. The original context is not dismissed. It's simply that the text is placed in a new context, and new meaning is given to an ancient prophecy. So what we have is, in these examples, prophecies or predictions from the ancient world can be used to find oneself in the present. And now we get to Matthew's method. We're going to look at Matthew now based on what we've covered so far, and I'm going to propose to you that Matthew is doing something very similar, which is complicated even more because we sometimes are dealing with Greek text versus Hebrew. People, again, polemically, will look at the Masoretic text and they'll compare it to a text in the Gospels and say, aha, the Hebrew says this, the Greek says this, and therefore, well, we're dealing at times in the Gospels with quotations from the Septuagint. And one other point on that, it's not as easy to dismiss the readings from the LXX, the Septuagint, because when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, at times it was discovered that the Greek of the Septuagint often matched more closely to a Hebrew text that was discovered at Qumran than it did the Masoretic text, which I know a lot of people will hold up as the whole truth, nothing but the truth, the authoritative, inerrant, inspired, etc., etc. Remember, the Masoretic text has been very, very consistent since the Middle Ages. But prior to that, and the Dead Sea Scrolls blew the lid off this idea. And you can read Emmanuel Tove and, criticism of the Hebrew Bible and some of his works to find out just these sort of things that we're talking about here. So I want to go and begin to look at the 4 prophecies that Matthew used. And we're going to go back into the Hebrew Bible. We're going to follow a similar pattern that we did when we looked at the text from these Pesharim from Qumran. So go with me to Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. Isaiah 7, verse 14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, the writer of Matthew takes that verse and uses it to frame up his story. His infancy narrative, he pulls that verse. He doesn't use verse 13. He doesn't use verse 15. He doesn't use anything in the surrounding context, but he found that verse, as he saw it, probably in the Septuagint, to be very important for his storyline. Just like they did in the Pesher, just like these other scribes at the time would find various ways to pull from an ancient prophecy and say, hey, I'm looking for a text about a woman who can see, aha. Now, if we really look closely at Daniel chapter 7, verse 14, in the Hebrew where it says hara and veyoledet, it really means is pregnant and beareth. In other words, not a virgin will conceive. Isaiah 7 says an alma, a young woman of marriageable age, is pregnant and is about to give birth to a baby. The immediacy of the story is what Isaiah 7 is all about. There's a historical context there. We're dealing with a pregnancy which is imminent, right? It's a birth that's going to take place in the time of Isaiah and Ahaz, King Ahaz. This is the context. Because what we're dealing with is a Syro-Ephraimite crisis. If you read chapter 7, verses 1 through 9, it tells you all about what's going on there in Isaiah chapter 7. Aram and Israel are united, and they're threatening Judah under Ahaz. Ahaz is the king. And so the point, in fact, let's read the point. Look at verse 15 through 17. Remember, Matthew just says, I'm going to use chapter 7, verse 14. It's all he needs, right? So here we go. Butter and honey shall he eat, when he knoweth to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose 2 kings thou abhorrest shall be forsaken. Jehovah will bring upon thee and upon thy people and upon thy father's house days that have not come, from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. Here's the point. Isaiah is telling Ahaz, the Lord's going to give you a sign. Ahaz, you. He says, what is it? He says, well, the young woman is going to bring forth a child, and he's going to be called Emmanuel. Emmanuel, God with us. Now, if Ahaz would have said, yeah, well, when's she going to have the baby? If he said 700 years from now, that wouldn't be much of a sign. He needs a sign now. He needs assurance that God is with him. He's got enemies breathing down his throat, right? So he wants to know that what is this God with us? Give me proof. Make me feel better about the circumstances. It's a contemporary period that's being talked about in Isaiah 7. Now, who is the child? This is where people go crazy, right? Now, I'm not talking about just the gospel writers. A lot of people say, "Oh, I know who that is." I've heard Bible teachers say it's Hezekiah, right? Might be. I don't think it is, but it could be, right? Some people claim that like definitively, but let me tell you what the text does not say. It doesn't give a name other than Emmanuel. Now, I think, in fact, let's look at a couple of passages about Emmanuel. Look at Isaiah chapter 8, and let's pick up verses 5 through 10. And Jehovah spake unto me yet again, this is the same context, the Ahaz prophecy. For as much as this people have refused the water of Shiloah that goes softly, and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son, now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria, and all his glory. And it shall come up over all its channels, it shall over all its banks. It shall sweep onward into Judah, it shall overflow and pass through. It will reach even to the neck. This is how close it's going to be. And stretching out of its wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. It's the same name. All right, so what does that mean? Make an uproar, O ye peoples, be broken in pieces, and give ear, all ye of far-off countries. Gird yourselves and be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, be broken in pieces. Take counsel together, and it shall be brought to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand. Why? Because God is with us. Now here it translates, but you know what the Hebrew says? Emmanuel. Emmanuel, this prophetic name for the child, is used to tell the story of what's going to happen. The water's going to get high. It's going to make you really nervous, but God is with us. Before the child gets, these two kings are going to be taken out of the picture. Well, that happened in Ahaz's day. This is the image. Again, some people say the child is talking about Hezekiah. And I know that there are rabbinic traditions about that. I think it could very well be Isaiah's child. Look with me at Isaiah chapter 8, verse 18. We're here in context. By the way, in verse 16, which I kicked off with, bind the testimony and seal the Torah among my disciples and so forth. I will wait for Jehovah that hides his face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for him. Verse 18, behold, I and the children whom Jehovah hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel from Jehovah of hosts who dwells in Mount Zion. So this is saying to me, Isaiah is telling me, according to the text. Isaiah is speaking, and he says God has given him children who will be signs for the times, not necessarily for 700 years from now. Let me give you a couple of examples of his boys. He's got a kid named Sha'ar Yeshuv. Sha'ar Yeshuv, beautiful name, child. Sha'ar Yeshuv means a remnant will return. He's got another kid named Mahar Shalal Hashbaz. That's a mouthful. Mahar Shalal Hashbaz, get in here, right? So what do we know about him? Let's look at a text. Let's look at Isaiah 8, verses 1 through 4. And Jehovah said unto me, by the way, this is all in this context. Take a great tablet and write on it with the pen of a man for Maher Shalal Hashbaz. And I will take unto me faithful witnesses to record. Uriah the priest, and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah. It's a long name. And I went unto the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. Then Jehovah said unto me, call his name Maher Shalal Hashbaz. For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria shall be carried away before the king of Assyria. That sounds a lot like what's going on in Isaiah 7. Could this be the same child, or is it a different child? Isaiah has a couple of kids, Sha'ar Yeshuv. Maybe he's got one named Emmanuel. Maybe he's got one named Maher Shalal Hashbaz. Now, let's look at one more child's name in Isaiah chapter 9, and let's go to verse 5 in the Hebrew. Let me do the Hebrew first. Ki yeled yulad lanu, ben nitan lanud, vathi hamisra al shikmo, vayikra shemo pele yoetz el gibor aviad sar shalom. What? For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given. Ki yeled yulad lanu, ben nitan lanu. And the government shall be upon his shoulder, al shikro. And his name shall be called Vayikra Shemo Pele Yoetzel Gibor Aviad Sar Shalom. What does that mean? It's translated, Pele is wonderful, Yoetz is counselor, Aviad is translated mighty God, or everlasting Father. El Gibor is mighty God, Father, Prince of Peace, Sar Shalom. This is yet another child mentioned in Isaiah 9. Now, when we get to the Galilean section, this is going to be very important. It's going to be very important because if you read in context what comes right before Ki yeled yulad lanu, ben nitan lanu, you're going to find that there's this darkness over the land. And then a child is born. Well, if I were writing a gospel story in the time of the Roman government controlling Judea in the Second Temple period, I'd say, man, using the method before me, that's a good idea, maybe. These are the ideas we're going to look at later, though. So now, given that, let's look at Matthew chapter 1 and verse 21 through 23. Matthew chapter 1, verse 21 through 23. And it says the following. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for it is he that shall save his people from their sins. Now all this came to pass that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is being interpreted, God with us. This follows, by the way, the Septuagint reading of what we see counter what we find in the Masoretic text of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. So whereas most apologists for the Masoretic text would go, look, they use a different word. One says alma, one says virgin. In Hebrew, this means this, and it can't mean that, and therefore they twist the scriptures. That's not what's really going on. Let's be honest. Let's be honest with the text. We're going to be honest with the Hebrew Bible. Let's be honest with the Gospels. The Gospel writer is using a technique that is prevalent in ancient literature. He's finding a way to put a text, take a verse out of context, but give it new life. Plant it in this new story. And what he does, he's really probably dealing with the translation, the Septuagint, right? But I do want you to notice a couple of things. In the story in Matthew, he's framing up the infancy narratives. What he wants to do is he's going to take the already pregnant young woman who's about to give birth in Isaiah 7:14, and he's going, hey, I have the same kind of thing going on here. And so he changes it in his text, following the Greek. It's a virgin who will conceive. Voila. You have new life on the scripture that had old meaning. You take an old prophecy, give it new life, and some of you might be saying, well, I don't agree with this. It's not the point of the class. The point of the class is to understand the way ancient people use these texts. It's not just a Hellenistic Greco, way to do things. This is what we find in the scrolls. They find themselves and their story in the text that they love. They give it new life. Next passage. Micah chapter 5. Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. Micah 5, verse 2. Here it is. But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, which art little to be among the thousands of Judah, out of thee shall come forth to me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting. Just that one verse. Just that one verse. Don't need the context. We're going to use that one verse, Matthew says, to frame up my story because I got something going on in Bethlehem. I got to take, where is it that, Bethlehem. I know a text, and Micah 5 is the one. Now, what I want you to notice is that in this text, it says, you, Bethlehem Ephratah, which art little among the thousands, the clans of Judah. What this is not talking about, at least on the surface, is a place. Bethlehem Ephratah, at least in context, is dealing with the clans of Judah, families of Judah. And this can be broken down. You can study, we might get into this in another class, but you find the source of this idea by tracing genealogies, endless genealogies in 1 Chronicles. So you go there and you're going to find family names, Bethlehem, Ephrat, Judah. You're going to find these, and this is the source of this. So the point of Micah 5 is that this is a clan. But little clan of Bethlehem, don't be so worried that you don't live up to the great thing because it's out of you, this clan, that a ruler, one whose goings forth are from antiquity, from days of old. Now, can Bethlehem, Ephratah, be a place? You bet it can. In the hands of the skilled interpreter, this text gets a makeover. Now, how can I say that? We're not going to go there. I want you to write this in your notes. In Genesis chapter 35, Rachel, they're at a place called Bethlehem Ephratah. Genesis chapter 35, verses 16 through 20. Put that in your notes. And she goes into labor. And she's in labor, and it's a hard labor. And as she gives birth to her son, she calls him Benoni, son of my sorrow. But the father, Jacob, changes the name to Benjamin, to son of my right hand. And she dies. Rachel dies. And where it says Bethlehem Ephratah, this is a little quick Hebrew lesson. It's Bethlehem. In Hebrew, it says towards Ephrat, because it's really Ephrat, but in Hebrew, when you add what's called the hey directive in the old grammars, it means toward. This is very specific. They reach a place called Bethlehem towards Ephrat, and she gives birth and she dies there. Bethlehem Ephratah. So a later writer could say, I've got a birth that takes place, and it takes place in Bethlehem. I'm going to use Micah 5. Well, that's perfect. Don't criticize it. That's the most creative thing that a later scribe can do. There's no other text that you would use. So polemically, someone might say, oh, well, there's some problems with what the Matthew does. Of course, that's the way you do it. Now, originally, the context had to do with an Assyrian threat. All right? And in fact, I want you to look with me now. Let's read Micah 5:2 in context and go through verse 6. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, which art little among the thousands of Judah, out of thee shall come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth is from old, from everlasting. Therefore will he give them up until the time that she who travaileth hath brought forth. Then the residue of his brethren shall return unto the children of Israel. And he shall stand and shall feed his flock in the strength of Jehovah, in the majesty of the name of Jehovah his God. They shall abide, for now shall he be great unto the ends of the earth. And this man, this one, shall be our peace. When the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he tread in our palaces, then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. They shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, the land of Nimrod and the entrances thereof, and he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and when he treads within our border. And then it goes on. In other words, there's a context here. The writer of Matthew doesn't need all of that. And you can be critical and you can say, well, you do if you want to understand it. It's not what they did. They're finding a way to put their current situation with an ancient prediction. Now, look with me at Matthew chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. This, by the way, is Herod is saying, hey, where is this king of the Jews that you're talking about? I'd really like to meet him, right? So verse 5, and they said unto him, in Bethlehem in Judea, for thus it is written through the prophet, and thou, Bethlehem, land of Judah, art in no wise least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come forth a governor or a leader who shall be shepherd of my people Israel. And the story goes on. Most of us know the story pretty well. So let me describe a couple of differences between the Hebrew, at least as we have it survived in the Masoretic text, that which was preserved faithfully from the Middle Ages. What we have there is the idea that Micah 5 is dealing with clans, a family. Here, notice it's different. Now, some might say, that dirty guy that wrote Matthew changed the inspired Hebrew. Or maybe the text he's looking at is an earlier version. We just don't know because we found examples where that is the case. But let's just say that it is interesting that in Micah 5, it talks about the clans of Judah. And the writer of Matthew, following closely more with the Greek, is going to say land of Judah. Well, now, we're not talking about a family so much as we're talking about a land. You see the differences. Sometimes they're subtle. Now, it's not that the writer doesn't know that this coming one is going to come from a clan and a land. In fact, we see in John chapter 7, verse 42, where it talks about the Messiah is going to be from the lineage of David in the place where he's from, Bethlehem, and, from a certain place and a certain family lineage. So they got that. They know that. But the language of Micah 5 is used to help frame up the gospel writer's infancy narrative. Now go with me to the next text, Hosea chapter 11. Hosea chapter 11. We're going to make a big deal out of northern prophetic text in the coming series. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. Now, if you're writing later, this is, by the way, the context is it's a poetic section of the prophet Hosea. He's talking about the Exodus. God's son, I called my son out of Egypt. Well, Israel is called the son of God. It's called the son of God in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22 and 23. Let my son go or I'll kill your son, as God famously told Moses to tell Pharaoh, which we have no record of him saying. But nonetheless, it's still there. My son, my firstborn son. We see passages elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible where Israel is called the Son of God. Matthew is going to use a part of this passage because he's got to find a way to have his central character go to Egypt and come back. So interestingly enough, let's look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 14. Matthew 2, verse 14 says the following. And he arose and took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt and was there until the death of Herod. Remember, 4 BC. That it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt did I call my son. Out of Egypt did I call my son. Well, that's part of what we read in Hosea. But see, the writer of Matthew doesn't need to tell the Exodus story. What he needs is to tell his own story using the language of Hosea, who talks about calling my son out of Egypt. He uses part of one single verse. Now, it is interesting, and those who have a polemic view of the Gospels would say, well, isn't that convenient that God's son, clearly named in Hosea, the name isn't mentioned. He doesn't need that part for his story. I'm being gracious here, right? Because I'm trying to show you how ancient interpretation worked. One more passage. I want you to look with me at Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 15. Jeremiah 31 and verse 15. This is all Matthew needs. Here it is. Thus saith the Lord, or Jehovah, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. Now, in this particular passage, there's a lot we could get into, but for time's sake, suffice it to say that the Hebrew is interesting. Her children, she's weeping inconsolably for her children because he is not. It can be interpreted to be singular there. Well, a writer who wants to describe what we see in Matthew's narrative can pick up on that idea. Now, also, I want you to understand that in Jeremiah, those of you who've been studying with me for a while know that we did a 25-week series on Jeremiah. So I won't go through all that with you, but I will say this. Jeremiah chapter 40 tells the reader, that something happens at Ramah. What happens at Ramah? Jeremiah chapter 31 says, bitter weeping in Ramah, Rachel weeping for her children. What does Jeremiah know about Ramah? I'll tell you what he knows. Ramah is a staging place for when the children of Israel were carried off into captivity. Do you not think that there's weeping going on? Can you imagine? Jeremiah's there. Read chapter 40 in your own time. He's there. He witnesses mothers weeping. He's weeping, I guarantee you. And he has this vision of Rachel watching her children as they disappear. That's the image. That's what he sees. But in Jeremiah 31, the children aren't dead. Rachel's not weeping because some king is killing her children. They're being carried off into captivity. It has nothing to do with the slaughter of the innocent babies. But look, let's read the rest of it. In fact, look at Jeremiah 31. Let's read verse 15 through 17. This is the context. Thus saith Jehovah, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuseth to be comforted for her children because they are not. Thus saith Jehovah, refrain thy voice from weeping and thine eyes from tears, for thy work shall be rewarded, saith Jehovah. They shall come again from the land of the enemy. There is hope for thy latter end, saith Jehovah, and thy children shall again come to their own border. Now, again, the gospel writer only uses part of that. Look at chapter 2 of Matthew, verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth and slew all the male children that were in Bethlehem and in the borders thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had exactly learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled, sounds like in the Pesher is, then was fulfilled that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children. She would not be comforted because they are not. You see, you say the gospel writer of Matthew is only using a small portion from these ancient prophecies. He's not giving you the context. He has the context. So even and by the way, in full disclosure, we don't know of a particular historical event where Herod killed all the babies 2 and under. But we do know that he was vicious and hateful and evil. And we do know that he killed his own kids. So it's not a stretch to say that Herod being associated with killing people, that's right up Herod's alley. So a writer knowing the evil of Herod could clearly put this story together. And here's what we know. Matthew doesn't need the idea of there's hope for the future because your son will return. By the way, his son in his gospel does return too. That's the whole point. This is the way that ancient writers of these gospel texts and the Dead Sea Scrolls gave relevance, took an ancient prophecy, timeless words of the past, and put it into a contemporary setting and read them anew. That's what's going on. Ancient interpretation saw prophecy as a living voice. Not always, and every detail was exact. It didn't have to be. That's not what they're doing. But what they saw it as was potential, a previous prophetic prediction pointing to the present. It wasn't to cancel out the original context, but it was to continue the relevance in a new context. It's not locked in the past, but it's potentially describing to the writer the present. That, ladies and gentlemen, was Matthew's method. If you're with me live and you're part of the Yakad, join me in the Zoom call which follows this class. If you're not yet part of the Yakad, you can get about 30 minutes of that on YouTube. You'll be automatically directed. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it, and also see the description of the video. There's a lot of books and links in there that might help you in your further studies. So have a beautiful day. Don't miss Sunday school next week. Thank you very much for joining me.